Anybody else drive a 20-year-old clapped out minivan? Honda Odyssey? Hey everybody, I'm so glad you stopped in. There's my pickup pile, and my repair pile is shrinking. Got an 036. We're going to take care of this right now. Got a Shindaiwa top handle that doesn't run correctly. A 261 that got ran over by a skid steer, or at least clipped by a skid steer. A two-man Hornet here for a simple service. And a lineup of 026s and 024s and an MS360. I'm excited to get down to these guys. Let's grab this Stihl 036. Get on my workbench. Hey everybody, welcome back to my workbench. My name is Erica, and I'm so glad that you're here. Today on the bench, we have a Stihl 036. So the customer who dropped this off said he found this in his father-in-law's basement shed, something like that. Found at his father-in-law's, and there's some other saws there as well where this came from. The father-in-law doesn't think this saw has been used in over 20 years. So he said when he found it, he called it turpentine in the fuel tank. So he dumped it out, put some fresh gas in it. He said he fired it up and ran it for a few minutes, but he said the fuel line in it is mushy. So he thought he'd better drop it off. Probably a good decision. So he said replace the fuel line, go over the saw with a fine-tooth comb. We don't know why this saw was parked 20 some years ago. I've seen this happen before, where a saw gets parked, the next generation comes and picks it up 10, 20, 30 years later, and the reason why the saw was parked is no longer known. Was somebody ill and couldn't run it anymore? Did they stop cutting firewood? Was something wrong with the saw, so it was set down and just the reason forgotten about? There are numerous possibilities here. Nobody knows why. So we're going to find out together. So we are going to go through this saw. We are going to do a fuel system overhaul. We are going to pressure vac test this thing, replace the fuel line and anything else that needs replacing. He said put a new chain on it. So we are going to go through this thing completely. I did a little bit of research on 036s. I wasn't repairing saws when this saw was made. I was barely out of diapers. So from what I could find online, 036s were produced between 1995 and 2001. So this saw is mid to late 90s, maybe early 2000s. Before the 036, the saw would have been called an 034 Pro. And then after the 036, you had your MS360, and then your MS361, and then now the current model is called an MS362. This is a 61.5 cc professional chainsaw. This is the Pro model. So you had 036s and you had 036 Pros. So this one had the decompression valve in it. If you watched a video I did a couple weeks ago, we had an 036 on the table here, and it had a big rental sticker across it, and it had self-tapping screws in the handle that were scratching up my workbench. So that was an 036, but not the Pro, and it didn't have the decompression valve hole in the top of the plastic, but it had a decompression valve hole in the cylinder because we discovered that saw had been rebuilt at some point in its life. I'm sure most of you seen that video, but if you didn't and you like these 036s, you may want to go back and check that video out. So let's dive into this 036 and find out why it was parked over 20 years ago. Come with me. Well, here we are with a nice example of a Stihl 036 Pro. We'll just do a quick little walk around in the saw, looking for any visible damage. First thing that kind of stands out is that air filter cover has obviously been hit with something, dented in a crack. You can still buy this cover, so I'll ask him. He may want to order a new one of these because the rest of the saw looks to be pretty good. You can't buy that Pro sticker anymore, not from Stihl anyways, but the plastic cover, yes. I don't know if all O36s had a plastic handle or if the later ones did. The clutch cover, that's just dirt. It looks in good condition. Like most of the paint is still on. The fact that that little white sticker is still hanging off the front of it there is a sign of low use. But the handles are all in good condition. Chain brakes in working order. That there is a nice looking saw. So I guess the first thing I'll do, I'll pull the bar and chain off this thing, get that out of our way. Well, the fella who dropped this off said that he fired it up for a minute, made a quick cut with it, and shut it off. So we probably will find maybe a little bit of kind of fresh, wet sawdust. This bar was made in Canada. This could be the original bar. They did used to have Oregon make them for them here in Guelph, Ontario. Chain catcher. It's been hit a few times. It's pretty clean. So as I said earlier, he said he dumped whatever stinky stuff was in there and he put fresh fuel in it. I'm going to dump that out, take a quick look at it. If it looks okay, we'll put it back in. And I want to just pop outside with the saw for a minute and just hear it run myself before we carry on. Got a clean container here. Yeah, so his fuel looks fine. There's no water in it. There's a fuel line in there, and there is no fuel filter on the end of it. Let me see if I can bring you in close enough. It's going to be hard to see, but the fuel line is in terrible condition. It's mushy. It's collapsing. It probably wouldn't grip a fuel filter, and that's why it's not on, and somebody must have, maybe when he dumped the fuel out of it, the fuel filter came out at the same time. I have grabbed onto the fuel line with a set of pliers. So the fuel filter rotted right off the fuel line. The end of the fuel line would be with that filter, probably in a bucket at someone's house. So there's what we have left. It's just mush. You can see there's just nothing left of it. This is what happens to fuel line when it sits in fuel for a long time. It's like Play-Doh. It just sticks to my pliers. It looks like I won't be taking this saw out to start it after all. I expected to find some fuel line in poor condition, but with a fuel filter still attached. I didn't realize it was that far gone. So we won't be doing that. We'll carry on with our inspection. I'm going to pull the air filter cover off. Air filter, pull the spark plug out. We'll have a look down into the piston and cylinder before we go any further. Let's take that air filter off. The plug doesn't look horrible. Little tan color. That is an NGK plug, so likely not the original plug. Let's pull the muffler off this and have a look from this side. So there, we had a look at the piston and the cylinder. You can see just the beginnings of scoring, but you can still see the factory cross hatching on the cylinder. I can smell the old turpentine fuel. I can smell it coming out of this thing. It's probably a good idea he stopped running it when he did. It was being ran with no fuel filter. The carb is probably full of dirt, and that old nasty fuel is coating the piston. That brownish color that you're seeing on the piston, that is that old nasty fuel that you're seeing on there. Well, let's go ahead and do a compression test. Looks like about 150 pounds of compression. So let's go ahead and do a pressure vacuum test. I'm going to pull the decompression valve out of the saw and put a plug in, and I'm going to pull the carburetor off of it. Nope. So this model has a compensator port, so I have to take this handle off to get the carburetor off. And we should be able to pull that off now. So the earlier 036s didn't have this because the last 036 we did 2 weeks ago, I don't believe we ran into that problem with the handle. So anyway, there's the carburetor off. I guess we can just pull that fuel line out of there and have a closer look at it. You ever seen a fuel line in that condition before? Stretchy and limp. We'll come back and look at this in a couple hours, and this will be hard as a rock, and I'll be able to snap that in half. I'll put this plug in where the decompression valve was. So our spark plug is in, our decompression hole is plugged up. Let's plug the exhaust up. Look what just came in the mail. Barrier cream. A lot of you have expressed a concern for my skin and all this gasoline that I touch, so I'll start wearing this stuff every day. Thank you for worrying about me. I appreciate that. Okay, so our exhaust is sealed up. Now we'll seal up the intake. This tool is going to plug up the intake and the impulse hole right there. I put washers on there just to protect the tool a bit. This saw has 4 manufactured holes. Well, 5. the intake and the impulse, which are sealed up, the spark plug hole, the decompression valve, and the exhaust port. So we have sealed all of them up. We are going to pull vacuum, and then we are going to put pressure to the saw, and this saw should be tight. There should be no vacuum leaks, no pressure leaks, and if there is, we're going to locate them. Let me grab my tool and we'll get started. Here's my pressure vac tester. I bought this from Stihl. So this tester does vacuum and pressure. So we're going to do vacuum first. Okay, so we are going to pull vacuum. And when you do this, you want to remember to have your piston at bottom dead center, which ours is right now. So we are set to vacuum. We are going to go to half a bar. Hopefully we are, and hold half a bar. And we have a leak. It's not what I wanted to see, but that's what I'm seeing. When you find a vacuum leak, the first thing you want to do is make sure that anything that you have, any plug that you've made, intake, exhaust, you want to make sure the leak is not there. So I'm going to put this over to pressure. And if we have a leak at pressure with soapy water, I'll check my connections and then we'll go from there. Something that I usually do before I use this tester is I make sure that the tester is working fine, but I didn't do that this time. So let's do it right now. I'm going to pull it back off the saw. So it's on vacuum. Put my thumb over the end of it and we pull vacuum. If I let my thumb off, okay, so our tool is working just fine. So our next step here is we're going to move this over to pressure. I am going to make sure that none of my connections are causing the problem. So I'm going to put pressure to the saw and use soapy water and make sure that the intake, spark plug, decompression, exhaust port, that my leak isn't there. And if we don't find any leaks at my connections, then we'll carry on. Okay, so let's see if we have a pressure leak. So we are on pressure. And we'll pump up to half a bar. And it is not uncommon to have a vacuum leak and not have a pressure leak. And we do not have a pressure leak. If we had a pressure leak, or if one of my connections were leaking, it would show here. So my connections are fine. The saw is not leaking pressure. The saw is leaking vacuum. So you can see that holding steady. Let's go back to vacuum. And you can see that. So to me, that screams out leaking crank seal, but we're going to find out for sure. So what if I were to just throw a fuel line in this like you wanted me to? Maybe just throw a rebuild kit in that carburetor and send it. Send it with a potential leaking crank seal. Not a good plan. We might be getting closer here to knowing why this saw looks lightly used and was set down 20 plus years ago. Was the owner frustrated? Did he know something was wrong with it? Has it been to shops maybe and no one could fix it? So many unknowns, but we are going to find out exactly what's wrong with this chainsaw. So you have seen me pull the carb off this, pull the muffler off, and plug everything up and hook my tester up. If I wasn't standing here talking and explaining this, I could have this whole test done in under 15 minutes. Any shop or person who tells you that doing a pressure vac test is too hard or too time consuming, you need to find yourself a new shop. If I called up to Stihl head office and said, I have a saw that doesn't run right, one of the first things they're going to say to me is, did you pressure vac test the saw? And if I said, no, it's too hard, it takes too long, you probably wouldn't be watching me on YouTube anymore. When the customer dropped this chainsaw off, all he originally wanted was for me to just put a new fuel line in it because it was mushy. I tried to explain to him that when a saw has been sitting for this many years with stinky old rotten fuel in it and a fuel line that looks like this, we should go a bit further. When you see something like this, you know you have more troubles. I didn't know that we would find any air leaks. I actually kind of expected that we wouldn't find any leaks, that we would just be doing a fuel system overhaul here. So this is a bit of a surprise to me, but you know what? Nothing much surprises me anymore. So we need to find the vacuum leak. Let's take some bets on where it is. My guess is clutch side crank seal. Let me know in the comments. Tell me what you think. I'll give you a minute, and then we're going to go find it. So before we go looking at the crank seals, there's one thing to look at out here. So in there at the end of my flashlight, that's the intake boot. I'm going to pull vacuum again, and then I'm going to one hand here, and I'm going to just move these around, pull them apart, just jiggle that intake boot around a bit and see if I can find a leak there. Actually, I'm going to put this on pressure because it will hold pressure. Okay, so we are at half a bar. And then I'm going to wiggle the saw like I just showed you, and you watch for that to move. And if that intake boot has a leak, we may detect it right here. There, I'm moving that thing back and forth. Is it moving at all? Nope, didn't move. Okay, so I don't think it's our intake boot. So let's keep digging. Well, let's get to the crank seals, and we will test both of them for leaks. For now, I'll just get my tool out of the way. Let's pull that recoil off. just in case I missed it earlier, we did an 036 video a week and a half or 2 weeks ago, and we looked through that saw to find the leaks, and I'm pretty sure that we found a crank seal leaking on the clutch side, and we found an oily mess all over this side as well. Do you remember that? I have to go back and watch that video and just refresh my memory. There, clutch is off. Use an impact gun at your own discretion. So when you take a clutch off with an impact and the flywheel is still on the saw, you run the risk of shearing the flywheel key. Now we've got the flywheel off of this, so there is no risk of that, but just got to be careful with the impact. Sometimes it's safer to do it by hand. On this saw, the flywheel key is replaceable, but that's not the case on every saw. Here's a flywheel off of an MS290. The flywheel key is built into the flywheel. You can see it there. So if you sheared that off, you would be buying a whole flywheel, and you don't want to do that. So just be very careful using an impact gun. Okay, so we have both crank seals exposed now. That mess in there. So I know someone's going to say, why didn't you clean that saw up? So everything is plugged up. There's no dirt getting into anything. I'm still in the diagnosing process here, and this saw will get cleaned up before it's put back together, but I want to find the faults in this first before I spend too much time cleaning it. Okay, so we are going to put pull vacuum on the saw and see if one or both crank seals is leaking. Okay, so we'll get the tool hooked back up here, and we will test the recoil side first. Let me get you in a position here so that you can see exactly what happens here. So there's our crank seal, and we are on the recoil side. I have my pressure vac tester hooked up, and we are going to pull vacuum. I'm going to put some oil on that crank seal. So when I pull vacuum, if there's a leak there, you're going to see that oil disappear. Ready? Okay, here comes the oil. And I'm going to start pulling vacuum. Listen. Oh no, where'd the oil go? How was that for a magic trick? So you just seen that crank seal suck all that oil in. So when I first pulled vacuum, it actually held for a few seconds because that oil kind of sealed it up for a few seconds. And then as soon as the oil went through, it leaked vacuum again, if that makes sense to you. I have put oil on this crank seal again, and I'm going to pull vacuum so that you can see what I just explained. So it will probably temporarily hold vacuum until that oil goes through. Okay, so you see it holding there. You can hear the oil leaking through. And there goes our vacuum. And the oil's gone again. Interesting, eh? Okay, well, let's flip this thing over and check out the clutch side. Okay, now I'm zoomed in on the crank seal on the clutch side. So let's do the same thing. I'm going to put some oil on it. Oops. And I'm going to pull vacuum. Maybe I was wrong in my bet on the clutch side. We still have a massive vacuum leak, but I don't think this crank seal is leaking. It will not hold vacuum. I can't even build vacuum. There you go. Flywheel side crank seal. Well, we know that the saw has a leaking crank seal. So before I go doing crank seals in this, I think we had better have a closer look at this carburetor. I'm told this saw's been sitting for over 20 years with fuel in it. So it wouldn't make much sense to go do a whole bunch of work to this and then to come to a carburetor that's not going to work for us. So let's take this thing apart and have a look inside. I'll go clean this thing up a little bit externally, and then we will open it up. Today we'll use the carb stand that Stu sent me. Thank you, Stu. Let's pull the pump side off of this and have a look in here. So a little screen is right there, and it is completely plugged full. Can you see that? So we did find it with no fuel filter. We don't know how long it ran without a fuel filter, but that would have caused a problem for us. Do you remember a couple weeks ago, we did a video about an 036 and X rental saw, And the carburetor on it said Hong Kong right there in that block. And this one says China. So China took over from Hong Kong in 1997. So we could assume that this saw, or at least this carburetor, is 97 or newer. And the 036 that we looked at a few weeks ago is older than that. Neat little facts, eh? This diaphragm is distorted, showing creases. It should be flat. It's probably original. Well, let's flip this over and pull the other side off. My fear was that we would find rust and corrosion and pitting in here, but it actually looks not too bad. There's some dirt. This sealant, let's see if I can show you this. See that there? The factory used to do that, but our fuel just destroys it. So that'll have to all be cleaned out. So I see no reason why we can't clean this carb and rebuild it, and it should be just fine. But I thought we'd better have a close look at this before we carried on, because after 20 years, you never know what you would find in here. Let's check the carb settings and see if they are where they should be. They don't look like they've ever been touched. Sometimes a person will jam the wrong size tool in them and mangle them. These ones look untouched. Let's put it on there. Let's give that a try. Oh, and here's your quiz for today. Who can tell me what chainsaw this screwdriver came with? Anybody know? Leave your answers in the comments. So there's our high jet, low. Let's see where they're set. So the high jet was out about a turn and a quarter. So I'll put it back to where it was. And let's check the low. It was out about 3/4 of a turn. I'll put it back. That was probably set like that right from the factory or the dealer. I'm pretty confident in this carburetor. I think we can clean it and rebuild it, and I think it will work for us. I wonder if that needle and seat are holding pressure. I should have tested that before I took the covers off, but we can try to test it here and see. I'll just put this back on. So I've got this tool here, pressure vac test tool. Just going to hook the line up to the inlet. Okay, so I'll just put some pressure to this. It is slowly leaking. Now that could be, it could be the seal I broke, taking that cover off, or it could be the needle and seat. Let me just get some soapy water and we'll see if we can find a leak. Yeah, right there. See, I broke the seal, so it's leaking there. But what I really want to know is if the needle and seat are leaking. I don't think so. I think it's just that. Well, I'm satisfied with what we found here with this carburetor. So let's put the carburetor aside and we'll bring that power head back over. I have spoke to the customer and briefed him on what I found here and that the saw needs more than just a fuel line. So he understands what's happening here, and he said just continue on. So first thing we're going to do is we're going to replace the crank seal on the flywheel side. The first thing I have to do here is, there's the flywheel key right at my fingertip. I got to remove that key. Flywheel keys out. Something I like to do so that I don't lose this is just stick it on the flywheel magnet. Let's pull that crank seal out. Crank seal puller. Okay, so I just push that right down in there on either side of the crankshaft. There, you can see how I have it packed in there between the crankshaft and the seal. I'm going to lower that down just till it touches the crankshaft. This used to have little wing nuts on here, but I've broke them, lost them, whatever. So I'll just use this. Just until it started to tighten, and then I'll come over to this side. So I just go back and forth and tighten them, and then I'll put a bit of pressure. And you're watching, you want the tool to want to pull the seal out rather than the tool pop out. And if these aren't tight enough, the tool will just pop out. So we'll try this, see if I've got them tight enough. Hopefully you can see what's happening here. Okay, so there is that crank seal out. This is the crank seal that was leaking. Now I have completely destroyed it by taking it out. So this will give you an idea of what I did here. So I slipped these jaws down, and then by tightening these, the jaws spread out a little bit to really grip this. And then when I turned this, it pushed down in the crankshaft and it pulled the crank seal right out. You can see how wrecked it is now, but mission accomplished. So here's our new crank seal for the flywheel side. There is the part number for it. Now there is a special tool to install this crank seal. I own it, but I can't find it. I just went over and dumped my husband's toolbox out because I thought maybe he stole it from my toolbox, but I couldn't find it there either. He's going to be really impressed when he comes in the morning. Shh, it wasn't me. We're going to have to use a real fancy tool to put this in. Mastercraft 14 millimeter socket press. Got a brass swing press here. This should work. I'm going to grease up the lips of this crank seal and slide it onto the shaft. As we're sliding it on, I'm going to pull it this way to try to avoid the key slot because it is kind of sharp and I don't want to damage the seal on it. So I'll just grease up the lips of this thing and we'll slide it on. So I'm going to press the seal down, not flush with this, but about a millimeter past this level. The proper tool to put the seal in actually presses the seal into the perfect spot. It won't let you go too far. But I'm not waiting for the tool to get here. So we're just going to go about it this way. I think that looks pretty good. Well, let's go ahead and vacuum test the saw again and see if that crank seal replacement resolved our issue. So we'll go over to vacuum, half a bar, and let's see if it holds. It looks to me like we no longer have a vacuum leak. What do you think? I think we got it. Well, we've replaced that crank seal. We no longer have a vacuum leak. So our clutch side crank seal is not leaking, but do you replace it anyways? When you blow out one sock and the other sock is not too far away, do you just throw your socks out and just start with a fresh pair? Yeah, sometimes I just keep wearing mine until my foot hurts. But in this case, for this saw, we're already here. I think we should replace this one as well. It's the same age as the other one. It would be a shame to go through all of this and not replace that. The seal's like $10 or less. So we're going to take this apart, clean this up, replace that crank seal, and then we'll start putting the saw back together. Here's a way to think about this. A $10 part like this can destroy a $500 piston and cylinder. What would you do? I know what I'm going to do. Just get that out of my way for now. And we'll get this all taken apart. Has anybody ever noticed that some saws, all the fasteners are like a goldish, yellowish color? Like this saw is. The recoil fasteners are all the same thing. Let's pull that brake spring off. Okay, this thing is heading outside for a little spot treatment. So I'll get this all cleaned up and I'll be back. Well, we were back from our day at the spa. It went very well. This saw was quite a mess. I get asked in the comments quite a bit how I clean these saws. So it depends on really how dirty it is. So this saw started off by going outside and getting sprayed down with a degreaser. Right now I'm using a degreaser called Zep. I have a bottle of it right here. So I just buy it in a big jug and then just follow the instructions. I put it in a spray bottle, spray the saw down, let it sit for a few minutes, take some compressed air to it and get the bulk of the chunks off of it. And then I ended up going to the parts washer with it and finish it off with some parts washer fluid and then wipe the whole thing down with a rag, which is very greasy, very grimy. I probably just spent 15 or 20 minutes cleaning this saw. Sometimes I spend more time cleaning a saw than I do fixing a saw. But when they're that dirty, I couldn't put it back together without cleaning it. Okay, so let's carry on with this crank seal job. A fuel pump has two T27s in it. I'm going to pull those out and then swing this fuel pump out of the way. We need to get down to that crank seal. Okay, there's our crank seal. Okay, so we got our old seal out, no problem. We're going to pop a new crank seal in there. There's the new one. There is the part number. So the other side, I couldn't find the tool, but this side I do have the tools here. So I'm just going to grease up the lip of this crank seal. So I'm going to slide this, I think they call it a sleeve. Just slide that. This where you can see it. There we go. Right down there. Now as I slide my crank seal on, that sleeve is going to protect the crank seal from getting damaged on the threads. Okay, so my crank seal has been greased. I'll push it down. And this is going to go on next. And this is only going to push the crank seal in exactly as far as it should go. Just like that. we go. Crank seal is in. 2 new crank seals. Let's hook up and do a vacuum and a pressure test. Make sure everything is good before we start reassembly. Okay, so we will pull vacuum. Half a bar. Looks perfect, doesn't it? Looks good. Okay, let's just go to pressure as well. Same thing, half a bar. We have a tight saw here. All right, well, let's start putting this thing back together. I'll just swing that oil pump back over and put the hardware back in. Well, let's go ahead and put this whole side of the saw back together. This looks to be in really good shape. The clutch is in good condition. The springs look good. Very tight. I don't think this saw's seen a lot of use. Okay, I'll just grease this bearing up. Put a new spark plug in this, NGK BPMR 7A, gapped properly. Let's put the flywheel key back in. There, we didn't lose it. Got a little bit of brake cleaner on this rag. Just gonna wipe the crankshaft off. You don't want any oil or grease left on there. flywheel nut is torqued down. Let's take the decompression plug out and put the decompression valve back in. Sorry guys, there's going to be some places in this video where you won't hear much from me. There's a lot of activity in the shop today. Lots of talking and hustle and bustle. So some of it I'll just make it quiet so you can see what I'm doing, but you just won't be able to hear what I'm doing. Lots of saws coming in today. We just had, what I see over there, I see an MS250 over there. I see a 170, a 361, and I seen a Husky come in. I think it was a Husky 572. So lots of new stuff coming up. Well, I'll get this out of the way, clean my bench up a little bit, and it's time to take care of this carburetor. Okay, so we're going to clean this thing and rebuild it. There's that screen in there. Let me just pick it out. Totally full of dirt. I'm going to take this thing over for a cleaning. I will be back. So this carb has been over and been cleaned. I had both jets out for cleaning. And I also replaced that nozzle valve there at the tip of my finger. Due to the age of this saw, I thought I'd just take care of that now. There's the old one there. So this is a little check valve. There's a little flap in there, and this is supposed to let fuel through, but not let air go back through. And when they get worn, old, dirty, they will let air back through, and that will cause an idle problem with the chainsaw. So due to the age of this thing, due to it sitting with fuel in it, and there being dirt in the carburetor, I think this part's $5. I'm just going to replace it. I'd rather do it now than I would take this all apart again. I should also say that this check valve isn't replaceable in all carburetors. So if you had an issue with it, in certain models, certain carbs, you'd be buying a whole carburetor. For this carb, I am able to get this check valve for it. Let's go ahead and rebuild this carburetor. An RB31 carb kit here from Stihl. That's set too low. We'll just bend it up a little bit. That looks good. Metering lever is set perfect. New screen. Okay, new screen is installed. I'm gonna hook my tool up and see if this carb will hold pressure. Yes, it does. Let's install a new fuel line. There's the part number. So I have the fuel line in. I use these, and I reached in and grabbed the fuel line and gently pulled on it in the tank while I gently pushed on it from the top, and it is in there now. Okay, let's put the carburetor back on. Handle is back on. I took this air filter apart and cleaned it up well. Well, we got it all back together. Let's put some fuel in it, some bar oil, and we'll take this thing outside. Well, what do you think? You think it's going to run? I'll meet you outside. Turn it on. Well, there you go. This thing runs excellent. Let's throw the bar and a new chain on it. So I have cleaned his bar up, took some rough edges off it. We're going to install it this way. And he wants a new chain. So he's full 3/8, 50 gauge, 66 drive links. 3/8, 50 gauge, 66 drive length. Well, this Stihl 036 is a beautiful little saw. It starts, it runs, and it cuts. It looks really nice, except for this little bit of damage to the cover, which could easily be fixed. So this saw was found in storage after, we figure, 20 plus years of sitting, and we don't know why it was sat down 20 years ago. It's possible that the owner had an issue with it because this thing did have a leaking crank seal. Maybe he knew something was wrong and set it down. Maybe he had it to a dealer and they couldn't fix it. Maybe they charged him and didn't fix it. We'll never really know. But I just know the saw looks like it's had little use, but why it was sat down, we don't know. Thank goodness the fella who picked it up noticed the mushy fuel line, likely because the fuel filter fell off is why he noticed it. But if he would have ran the saw, he probably would have destroyed the saw. So thank goodness for that. So when he brought it in, he said the fuel line is mushy. And I suggested we go look a little deeper because of the condition of that fuel line. There was probably some more things that we should be looking for. So you came with me and we did a full pressure vac test on this. We found one leaking crank seal, so we replaced the pair of them. We rebuilt the carburetor. We found a little screen in the carb packed right full of dirt. The fuel line, of course, was destroyed. New fuel line, new fuel filter, new spark plug, cleaned his air filter. And of course, the saw has had a really good cleaning and a brand new chain. It's a pretty impressive little machine. So I think it's ready for pickup. I'm going to give him a call and tell him he can come and get it. I have a whole line of saws over there waiting for me. Time for a coffee and on to the next chainsaw. Thank you so much for watching.